Hey everybody, how's it going? This is Steve with Alldogs Offroad, enjoying this bitterly cold Tuesday in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I have another video for you guys. This is one that's been requested multiple times, so I figured I'd knock it out of the way and do the best job I possibly can. So, pardon if I'm a little bit bouncing between topics here. Just wrote down some notes, and it's going to be pretty basic video. This isn't going to be like production quality or anything, just figured I'd get this info out there. So when people ask about budget lifts, there's often misconceptions. There's also a lot of assumptions made, and I'm going to do my best to get this get the best info possible out there. There's generally 3 types of budget lift options available to you when you're lifting your truck, and here at Alldogs we work primarily with the Toyota and Nissan platforms. So these are the ones I'm going to be focusing on, but this video is also going to be applicable to any independent front suspension vehicle that has coilover style shocks. So let's get started. The 3 styles of budget lift options that you're going to see out there are going to be, first is the top hat spacer, second are ride height adjustable shocks such as this Bilstein 5100 that I have here, and the third style is going to be lift springs, such as this Alldogs Offroad Toyota lift spring that we have here. Each option is going to be significantly different from each other, but they also have some similarities. I'm going to go over those as well. So the first one that I mentioned is the top hat spacer. It's going to look something like this. Most top hat spacers that you see out there are going to be much taller than this. This is only about a 1/4 inch tall. Most of the ones you're going to see are going to be between 1.5 inches tall, all the way up to 3 inches in some extreme cases. So this 5100 here from Bilstein that we have is ride height adjustable, and what that means is, it means that the shock has grooves cut into the shock body that allows you to move your lower spring perch from 0 inches of lift and tune it all the way up to 2 inches of lift and sometimes up to 2.5 inches of lift, depending on the vehicle that we're working with. So the coil springs are pretty simple. They bolt onto your shock and they lift the vehicle. We'll go into that more in a second. So one of these things is not like the other when it comes to the primary style of lift, and that would be the top hat spacer is different from the other options because the top hat spacer makes your shock assembly physically longer. The distance from the top of the top hat to the center of the eyelet is increased when you use a top hat spacer, while when you move your lower spring perch up and down on this shock, the distance from the eyelet to the top of the top hat remains unchanged. And that is also accurate with a lift spring because it simply fits between the top hat and the spring perch, and the distance between the lower mount and the top mount remain the same. That's important for a couple reasons. When you have a top hat spacer on your truck, you slap it on, drop it off the jack, congratulations, you have, we'll say, 2.5 inches of lift, right? Your tires are now 2.5 inches lower, your hubs are 2.5 inches lower from the fender at ride height. But one thing to remember is your full droop location is also going to be significantly lower, and your full compression location is also going to be lower. Top hat spacers merely move the, we'll call it, this is not a technical term at all, call it a travel zone, so to speak. It moves your travel zone down. That's all it does. It just pushes your shock down. You have more droop, but you have less compression, and that's how the lift works. Now, as we said before, a Bilstein 5100, the distance between your lower shock mount and your top hat remains unchanged. You merely preload the spring within the assembly. So what that means is you slap on a Bilstein 5100, you drop it off the lift, you have, we'll say, 2 inches of extra ride height, but your full droop location remains stock and your full compression location remains stock. Now when I say stock, I don't mean to the exact millimeter, because when you have a different shock, the lengths of the shocks are going to vary ever so slightly between, an OEM shock or a Bilstein 5100, an Old Man Emu, a Dobinson's, Radflow, Fox, whatever. But as a general rule, for all intents and purposes, your full droop location is going to be factory and your full compression location is going to be factory. The only difference is where your shock settles once the weight is dropped onto it. Now, that principle is the same with a lift spring, except a lift spring uses a combination of higher spring rate and preload to achieve lift, while a ride height adjustable shock only uses preload. So excessive preload can cause poor ride quality, as can excessive spring rate. So what we do with our Alldogs springs is we use a mild combination of each to achieve the best lift possible, while having the best ride possible. So let's talk about the implications on a lift spacer versus a preload lift or a coil spring lift, as far as real world examples go. And that difference is going to be, this is going to be Nissan specific really quick, so Nissan guys listen up. Due to the way that Nissan designed their upper control arm, I don't understand why it was designed this way. There are some difficulties on implementing spacer lifts. When Nissan designed their upper control arms, this is a Nissan upper control arm, by the way. It's SPC, but let's assume that this is an OEM arm just for argument's sake. They positioned their upper control arm directly above the coil bucket, and the coil bucket is where your upper shock mount connects to the frame. Just take a peek on your vehicle, you'll see it. It's pretty easy to locate. So it sits like this. It sits like this. And when you jack the truck up all the way, no lift, no mods at all, your upper control arm droops like this. All is well, no problems. Cycles with your suspension, no issues. Now, remember, when we talked about the spacer, it increases the extended length of the coilover. And here's what that means. While your previous full droop location was here with factory options, when you put that spacer down and it pushes everything down, your upper control arm needs to be able to accommodate for that extra droop that your lower control arm is seeing. And what happens is, on OEM control arms, you hit a bump and your suspension goes to unload, you hit your coil bucket with your upper control arm. That is very loud, it's annoying, and it puts extra wear and tear on your suspension. And in extreme cases, we have seen catastrophic failure of OEM upper control arms because of the repeated just bashing of the coil bucket by the upper control arm. Now, that problem can be solved with aftermarket upper control arms, such as SPC, which we have here, because it has a better clearance on the inside, and it allows for that extra droop without contacting your coil bucket. Here's a problem, though. Remember, this video was about budget options? While the spacer itself may be very affordable, don't be fooled, because in order to properly implement it, you need to buy these control arms, which are over $550. So if we're coming at this discussion from the perspective of, I just bought a $30 whatever $1,000 vehicle and I want to lift it, but I'm on a budget, but I want to implement it properly, spacers are going to be the most expensive solution to your budget lift needs. So, because you have to take in mind the extra money it takes to implement it. So, now, with Bilstein 5100s, your full droop location doesn't change, as we talked about, so your upper control arm isn't going to hit the coil bucket. This is a misconception all the time on the internet forums. You'll see somebody say, after X amount of lift, it is always required to have upper control arms. Sure, from a alignment perspective, you want upper control arms after a certain number, but from a coil bucket perspective, that's not necessarily an accurate statement. Because this Bilstein 5100 can go up to 2 inches of lift, and you don't need upper control arms because your full droop location is going to be the same as factory. So That's one thing to take into account. 5100s will not cause coil bucket contact regardless of the setting they're on. Coil bucket contact is determined by your extended length of your shock. And the only way to extend the length of a shock is to add a top hat spacer. And then you're going to need upper arms, and it gets really expensive. These are $124 a pop, so you can get into a 2-inch lift that's going to ride really well, no coil bucket contact, for a very affordable price. Now, lift springs operate in a similar way, where they don't extend the length of your coilover assembly, so coil bucket contact is impossible, and that gives you the lift that you want. Another great option, and it's $180 for a pair of these lift springs, which is a great option where, you buy a truck, you roll it off the lot, and you say, well, I want to lift it, but my shocks are in great shape, what do I do? You don't feel that you need 5100s right away, and that's fine. So what you do is, you pick up a set of these lift springs, bolt them on, your shocks are in great shape, fits perfectly, and you can just go about your day, and you have the lift numbers that you want. And then, later down the road, you say, yeah, I want a better shock. My shocks are wearing out, or I just, I want to throw a tax return at something. I want to throw some play money at something, So what you do is, you pick up a Bilstein 5100, you leave it at the bottom setting, and the lift springs that you already have, you slap it on, and you're good to go, and you have a new shock, same lift numbers, all good to go. Now, one of the questions that get asked almost daily is, customer hits me up and he's like, hey Steve, I have Bilstein 5100s right now, and they're set on the 2-inch lift setting. Great. I saw that your coil springs offer up to 2.5 inches of lift. Can I combine that with my 5100s to get 4.5 inches of lift? Please don't do that. Your ride quality is going to be awful. You're going to have zero down travel. It's going to ride like a brick. That is pushing shocks beyond acceptable limits, and it's just going to be awful for you. Remember, this discussion is based around the fact that we're attempting to implement these lifts as well as possible. We're going after the best implementation we can for the budget. So, even though you see spacers on the internet for $60, $30, whatever, these are by far the most expensive to implement, especially on the Nissan platform. And then, next, most expensive is going to be a Bilstein 5100, any ride height adjustable shock. And then the most affordable option is going to be a set of lift springs. Now, for the Toyota guys, spacers are also bad for your suspension, just in a different way. You don't have to deal with coil bucket contact, but one thing that you do have to deal with is you have that stem on your shocks that separates, so you have that stem that separates your eyelet from your shock body. And one thing that happens is, anytime that you add a spacer, remember your full compression is now at a lower position. So let's say that this is your bump stops and this is your lower control arm. In a normal instance of driving from the factory setup, you hit a massive hit. Wherever you are, you're off-roading, you hit a big rock. Whatever the situation, what happens is your lower control arm compresses really quickly, hits the bump stops, which then transfers all of that energy through the bump stop into the frame. Great, that's how it should be. But let's say that you get that spacer lift in there, your lower control arm, now the full compression is a little bit lower. So when you take that big hit, your shock can internally bottom out before you contact your frame bump stops. And what happens there is, instead of that energy being transferred into the bump stop, it's then transferred into your coilover, which is something that you don't want. It can damage your suspension and cause you a lot of issues down the road. Hi, Chad.
Hello.
Okay. So the solution to that is longer bump stops to make sure that when your suspension compresses, it hits the bump stop before your shock internally bottoms out. That's something that you need to just measure on your own and make sure that you get that taken care of, or else you can have the stem on the Toyota shocks can bend or break entirely, and it is not a good situation. So I hope that gave you a pretty basic idea of how everything works. People look for budget lift options and they end up getting themselves into a pickle because they bought something and then they realize, oh, it actually costs significantly more to implement this properly. Now, one of the last things that I see people doing all the time is they get a lift spring, they get an adjustable shock or whatever, and then they want to take it higher, and they want to slap this spacer on. Budget 3-inch lift, budget, whatever. The problem with this is, for a Nissan, anytime that you extend the length of your shock, you need upper control arms. So, again, if we're talking about a budget option, one thing that I say to people is, sometimes this extra 1/4 inch, this extra 1/2 inch, or whatever you want to get from a spacer, sometimes it's just not worth it for the headaches it causes and the extra cost to implement. So, one thing that I want you to take away from this is, I want you to have a realistic expectation out of your suspension when you go into this. We have to work with what Toyota and Nissan designed, and we have to make the best lift possible for the design that we're given. It's similar, I'm going to geek out here for a second, but in Lord of the Rings, Fellowship of the Ring, when they're in the Mines of Moria and Frodo's talking to Gandalf, Gandalf says something along the lines of, what makes us is what we do with what we're given to us, and very, very similar principle, If we have the opportunity to fab up our own mounts, yeah, we'd give you a suspension option with 36 inches of travel, easy, but we can't do that. So there are limitations to your suspension, and in order to properly implement it on a budget, you have to stay within a certain range, and that's just the nature of the suspension that we're working with. But don't want to kill all your hopes and dreams. You can really get a great budget setup, and when I say budget, I mean $300 and under for the front. More realistically, $200, $250 at the most expensive for the front. We can talk about rears in another video, but I hope that covered the basics of front suspension and how to implement it correctly, and what you're going to spend. So, thanks for watching. This is Steve from Alldogs Offroad. Have a good one, everybody.